I spent 9 months building that little cedar house by hand, and my father flicked the keys out of it with 2 fingers, like he was clearing crumbs off a table. They skidded across the white quartz island and stopped beside somebody's half-empty wine glass. For 1 second, nobody spoke. Then my mother laughed. Not loudly, just enough. The housewarming was in my new place. Open kitchen, Long Island, living room behind it with all the lights too bright because my mother said dim lighting made a house look cheap. There were maybe 20 people there. My father's law partners, their wives, 2 neighbors from the old street, the kind of people who hold a wine glass by the stem and look around your house like they are checking whether it deserves itself. My cedar house was sitting in the middle of the island, about 18 inches long, tiny black shutters, little porch. The front door even opened if you turned the brass key. Inside, under the floor panel, was the gift. The real gift. But they never looked long enough to find it. My mother leaned forward and tapped one fingernail against the roof. She said, "Well, this is homemade." Then one of her friends smiled into her Chardonnay and said, "I suppose that's sweet." My father picked up the key, turned it over once, then tossed it back down. He said, "Honestly, Claire, where would we even put this?" Claire. Not honey, not sweetheart, not kiddo. Claire. The way he used to say my name when I was in trouble as a child, or when he wanted everybody in the room to remember exactly where I belonged. I was still standing there holding the empty gift bag. I had sawdust under one thumbnail because I had been sanding the base that morning. If you've ever stood in a room and realized the people embarrassing you are enjoying the audience almost as much as the humiliation, you probably know this feeling. I bent down, picked up those keys, said, "You're right." And by the next morning, one of my father's law partners was calling him in a panic. My mother looked relieved when I said that. "You're right," like she thought I had finally learned the script. One of the women near the sink asked what I did again. Before I could answer, my father smiled. He said, "Claire works in records down at the firm. She's basically our file clerk." Basically, I had worked at Harmon and Pierce for 11 years. I knew every archive box, every probate filing, every old land transfer and trust amendment in that building. When the partners needed something impossible found in less than an hour, they called me. But in my father's mouth, I became a clerk. Just a clerk. The room softened around him. People smiled, nodded. One of the men said, "Nothing wrong with that." The way people do when there is obviously something wrong with that. Then my mother looked at the little cedar house again. She wrinkled her nose and she said, "Honestly, darling, this gift is trash. You should have just brought wine." Everybody laughed. Not hard, just enough. I looked down at the tiny brass key in my palm, then at the little house, then at my parents. And for the first time in my life, I stopped trying to make them proud long enough to notice something strange. Neither of them had recognized the front porch, even though I had built it from the original plans to my grandfather's house. I need to say this before I tell you the rest. What happened is true. A few details are softened because there are people still alive who do not deserve every private thing laid out in public, and because after enough years the rooms blur together a little. I sometimes use AI to help me keep the timeline straight when I tell this story. But none of that changes what they said in that kitchen, or the sound those keys made hitting the counter. If you have ever spent so long making yourself smaller that people started believing you really were, you already know how easy it is to confuse invisibility with peace. I was the oldest daughter in a family of attorneys. My father founded Harmon and Pierce with his best friend right after law school. My mother chaired every fundraiser, every board, every charity gala where women wore pearls and talked about service while someone else cleared the plates. Then there was me. I did not become a lawyer. I tried for 1 semester. That is still difficult for me to admit. I lasted exactly 4 months of law school before I started waking up in the middle of the night, unable to breathe. I told my father I did not think I could do it. He looked at me across his office desk and said, "Then at least do not embarrass the family." So I came home, and because I still wanted him to look at me the way he looked at the partners, and the sons, and the people he respected, I took the only place he offered me: records, archives, back rooms. 11 years in the basement of Harmon and Pierce, where the fluorescent lights buzzed and the old probate files smelled like dust and paper and mildew from before I was born. My office badge said records clerk. I kept it in my wallet because some part of me thought if I carried the title around long enough, maybe it would stop hurting. It never did. The thing is, I was very good at it. better than anyone else. I knew where every old trust was filed, every deed, every corporate transfer, every sealed family settlement nobody wanted to remember. The partners would come downstairs with their jackets off and panic in their faces because something was missing. A boundary agreement, an original signature page, a forgotten codicil from 20 years earlier, and I would find it always. Then they would thank my father for hiring such loyal staff. Staff, not daughter. One afternoon, a receptionist named Marlene stood in the copy room watching me haul 3 archive boxes onto a cart. She said, "You know, everybody in this building acts like you're the help, but you're the only person who actually knows where anything is." I laughed. I actually laughed. Then I told her that was just how families were. No, that was not true. That was just how mine was. My younger brother Andrew became a lawyer. Of course he did. He made partner at 36. There is a picture of my father hanging the partner plaque in Andrew's office. My mother had it framed. When I bought my house last year, they came for exactly 22 minutes. My mother said the ceilings were low. My father asked if I was sure the neighborhood was safe. Then they left before I could show them the backyard. That housewarming was the first time they had been back. I spent weeks planning it. I ironed the tablecloths. I polished the windows. I cooked everything myself. The cedar house had taken 9 months. Every Sunday afternoon, every evening after work, I built it in my garage from scraps of cedar and the original plans to my grandfather's house that I found in an archive box nobody had opened in years. I told myself it was sentimental, that my parents would finally see that I knew something they did not, that I had made something beautiful. The embarrassing truth is I wanted them to love me in front of other people. I wanted one room, one night, one moment where my father looked at me with pride instead of tolerance. Instead, he tossed the key, and my mother called it trash. The thing they did not know was that when I found my grandfather's house plans in the archive basement, I found something else. A sealed file marked with my grandfather's handwriting, for Claire only. I had not opened it then. Not really. I had slid it back into the box and told myself it was none of my business. That is what I always did when something threatened the version of my family I had spent years surviving. I put it away. I made dinner. I kept the peace. Then my mother called my gift trash in front of 20 people, and suddenly all I could think about was that file. After everyone left that night, I stood alone in my kitchen. The wine glasses still out, lipstick on one of them, crumbs on the counter. The little cedar house, still sitting there where my mother had left it, turned slightly away like even it had been dismissed. I picked it up, turned the key, opened the tiny front door, and underneath the floor panel, exactly where I had hidden it, was the file number, the one that matched the sealed box in the basement archive at Harmon and Pierce. I drove to the office before sunrise. The parking garage was still half empty. My heels sounded too loud in the stairwell, and for a second, I had the ridiculous thought that maybe I should turn around and go home and pretend none of it had happened. That was always my instinct. Make it smaller. Make it survivable. The archive room was in the basement behind records and litigation storage. No windows, gray carpet, the same humming fluorescent lights that made everybody look slightly sick. I still had my key card. Of course I did. I was the one who programmed half the access levels. The sealed box was exactly where I had left it. Third shelf, back wall, property transfers, and estate planning. Harmon family, private. My grandfather's handwriting again. The file number from inside the little cedar house matched perfectly. I sat down at the metal table in the archive room and opened the box. Inside was a manila folder, one brass key, and a letter. Claire, if you are reading this, then your parents finally made the mistake of showing you exactly who they are in front of witnesses. I stared at that line for a long time. Then I kept reading. Your father believes that because he built the firm, he owns the family. Your mother believes that because she protects appearances, she protects the truth. Neither one understands that truth survives without them. Inside this file is the original transfer for the Harmon lot on Willow Street. Not the house, the land beneath it, the land under my parents' house, the office building, half the parking structure, everything my father had spent 20 years leveraging to make himself important. The property had never been transferred to him, not legally. My grandfather had put it in trust for me. I stopped breathing for a second. No, not for me exactly. For whichever child in the family understood how to keep records, how to notice, how to stay when everyone else only wanted to be seen. There was an amendment attached, signed, notarized. The beneficiary named in the final version was me, Claire Harmon. There was one condition. If any family member publicly humiliated, diminished, or denied the beneficiary in connection with the family business or inheritance, all rights reverted immediately. I thought about the keys hitting the counter, the laughter, my mother saying, "This gift is trash," my father calling me a clerk in front of the partners. And suddenly I understood why my grandfather had built the little house plans into the file. He had known, maybe not the exact room, maybe not the exact words, but he knew what kind of people my parents were when they had an audience. I took the file upstairs to Martin Pierce's office, senior partner, my father's best friend, the other name on the door. His assistant looked startled when she saw me. I was usually only allowed upstairs if somebody needed boxes moved or signatures found. I said, "I need to see Mr. Pierce." She started to tell me he was in a meeting. Then she saw the folder in my hand and my face, maybe because she stood up immediately and opened the door. Martin was at the conference table with 3 other partners. Coffee cups, laptops, one of them still laughing at something. I set the folder down in front of him. He looked annoyed at first. Then he saw the file number, then the key, then my grandfather's signature. His whole face changed. He opened the folder, read the first page, then the second. Then he stood up so fast his chair hit the wall. He said, "Where did you get this?" I said. My father threw it away. Nobody spoke. Martin looked down at the papers again. Then he said something I had never heard him say in my entire life. He said, "Miss Harmon, not Claire, not kiddo, not sweetheart, Miss Harmon." Then he picked up the office phone and called my father. I could hear only Martin's side. "Richard, pause. No, listen to me." Longer pause. Then Martin looked at me, actually looked at me, and his voice changed. "Richard, you need to come in immediately." Another pause, then. "No, this isn't about the housewarming." He looked down at the key in his hand, then back at the papers, then at me. "It's about Claire." For the first time in my life, the room did not get smaller. When someone said my name, it got very, very quiet. If your parents mocked the one thing that could unravel everything they built because they never thought you were important enough to understand it, what would you call that? Arrogance, cruelty, or something worse? Because they taught you to believe it too. An hour later, my parents walked into that conference room, still laughing about my trash gift, and Martin handed my father the deed to land he never legally owned. My parents arrived together. That almost made me laugh. They came into the conference room still carrying the housewarming with them. My mother had on the same cream jacket. My father still smelled faintly like his cologne, and the expensive scotch he drank after parties when he thought it made him look relaxed. He walked in smiling. Then he saw me. Then he saw Martin standing beside the conference table instead of sitting at it. Then he saw the folder. The smile disappeared. My father said, "What is this?" Martin did not answer right away. The other partners were still in the room. 2 of them had been at my house the night before. One of them was the man who had laughed when my father called me a clerk. He would not look at me now. My mother saw the little brass key sitting on the table and actually smiled. That is what still hurts. She thought this was about the gift. She said, "Claire, honestly, if you were upset, you didn't have to make such a production out of that silly little house." Silly little house. Martin looked at her, then at me. Then he said very quietly, "Mrs. Harmon, I would advise you not to say another word until you understand what is on this table." The room changed. My father straightened. That partner voice came into him. The one he used in court. He said, "Martin, if this is about Claire being emotional after last night." Martin cut him off. "Richard, sit down." Nobody in that room had spoken to my father that way in years. Not since my grandfather died. For one strange second, he looked old. Not elderly, just suddenly. Not the largest person in the room anymore. He sat. My mother sat beside him, still confused, still irritated. Martin opened the file. Then he slid the deed across the polished conference table toward my father. The original transfer for the Willow Street parcel. My father looked at it once, then again. Then his face lost all its color. "No," he said. "Just that. No." Martin said, "Your father never transferred ownership to you." My father laughed too quickly. He said, "That's impossible." Then he picked up the paper. I watched his hands, the same hands that had flicked the key across my kitchen counter the night before. They were shaking. My mother leaned toward him. "What is it?" He did not answer her. He kept reading. Then Martin placed my grandfather's letter on top of the deed. The room went very still. My father read the first line silently. Then his eyes moved to me. Then back to the paper. Finally, he read it out loud. "If you are reading this," then Richard finally confused humiliation with authority. One of the partners inhaled sharply. My mother looked at me, then at my father, then back at me again. I do not think she had ever imagined there were parts of our family she did not control. My father kept reading. "Your daughter is the only person in this family who understands how to preserve what matters. You taught her to stand in the background because you mistook usefulness for weakness. If you humiliate her publicly in connection with the family business or inheritance, all rights revert immediately." I could actually see the room reinterpret itself. The men who had laughed in my kitchen. The woman who had smiled into her wine glass. All of them sitting there remembering my mother calling my gift trash. Remembering my father saying, "File clerk." Remembering me standing there with the keys in my hand. One of the partners finally said, "Richard, was this at the housewarming?" Nobody answered. Nobody had to. My mother made a small sound. Then she said, "Claire, we didn't mean it." I almost believed her. That is the worst thing about me. Even then, even after years of being introduced like staff and seated at the end of tables and talked over in rooms I had cleaned and planned and held together, some part of me still wanted to make it easier for them. Then my mother said, "You know how your father gets around people." And there it was, the truth. Not an apology, an explanation. The same one she had been giving my whole life. "He didn't mean it. You're too sensitive. Don't embarrass him." I looked at her, then at the men in the room, who had watched it happen, then at the brass key sitting between us. And suddenly, I was not embarrassed anymore. I was angry, quietly, completely. I picked up the key, held it in my palm. Then I said, "No, you knew exactly what you were doing." My father stood up so quickly his chair rolled backward. He said, "You would destroy this family over a misunderstanding." I looked at him, at the man who had spent my whole life acting like my worth was something he got to measure. Then I said the thing I had never said before. "You built this family on the assumption that I would always stay small enough to protect it." Nobody moved. Then Martin looked at my father and said, "Richard, if Claire files this, the property reverts immediately." My father stared at me. My mother put one hand over her mouth. And for the first time in my entire life, when somebody said my name in that room, it sounded like power instead of apology. If someone spends years teaching you that you are only valuable when you stay invisible, then panics the second you stop, what would you call that? Would you call it love? Would you call it family? Or would you finally call it what it was? After that meeting ended, I went back to my parents' house one last time and took the little cedar house off my mother's sideboard. I drove to my parents' house that afternoon while they were still at the office. The front door was unlocked. Of course, it was. My mother had always said a good neighborhood was one where people did not need to lock things. What she meant was a neighborhood where everyone already knew who belonged. The house smelled like lemon polish, and the lilies she always kept in the front hall. Everything was exactly where it had always been. The umbrella stand, the silver bowl for keys, the framed photograph of Andrew in his graduation robe on the console table by the stairs. Mine had never been there. That detail hit me harder than I expected. Not because it was new, because suddenly I could not stop seeing all the old things clearly. The way my mother kept my brother's wedding picture in the living room and mine in the upstairs hallway. The way my father called Andrew, my son, and me, Claire, like I was a person he had met through work. The little cedar house was on the sideboard in the dining room. My mother had put it there after the party. Not thrown away. Not displayed. Just moved slightly off to the side between a crystal bowl and one of those heavy silver candlesticks she polished every Christmas, like she did not know what to do with it, but could not quite bring it herself to throw it out. I stood there for a minute, looking at it, the tiny shutters, the porch, the little brass keyhole. 9 months of evenings in my garage. 9 months of hoping. I picked it up carefully. Then I opened the drawer beneath the sideboard and found the key exactly where she had dropped it after everyone left. I put it in my pocket. The thing I thought I would feel was triumph. I didn't. I felt embarrassed. Not because I was taking it back, because I had ever offered it. There was a note on the kitchen counter in my mother's handwriting. Call florist, return silver tray. Talk to Claire. 3 errands all in the same blue ink. I stared at that for longer than I should have, because even then, after everything, some part of me was still looking for proof that I mattered in a different category than chores. My phone rang while I was standing there. Martin, I answered. He said, Claire, before your father left the office, he asked if there was still a way to keep this quiet. I leaned against the counter. The kitchen window over the sink was open a crack. I could hear somebody mowing a lawn down the block. Martin went on. He said if the property reverted, people would talk. People, not you, not us, not what he had done, just people. I closed my eyes. Then I said, I know. Martin was quiet for a second. Then he said very gently, You don't owe them silence. I think that was the moment it finally shifted. Not when I found the file. Not when Martin said, Miss Harmon. Not even when my father read my grandfather's letter. This, standing alone in my parents' kitchen with the little cedar house in my hands, and realizing the arrangement had only ever worked because I kept agreeing to disappear inside it. I took the possession order out of my purse, folded it once, left it on the kitchen counter under my mother's note. Not dramatic, not cruel, just exact. Then I walked through the house one last time, the dining room, the study, the hall with all the family pictures. At the top of the stairs, there was a photograph of all of us from 15 years ago. My father in the middle, my mother beside him, Andrew close at his shoulder, and me at the end of the row holding a tray of drinks because somebody had asked me to bring them in right before the picture. I took that one off the wall, not because I wanted it, because I was tired of leaving proof behind. When I got back to my car, I put the cedar house on the passenger seat, the key beside it. Then I looked at my office badge lying in my purse, records clerk. I held it in my hand for a second. Then I took a pen from the glove compartment and wrote one word across the plastic cover. Owner. When my parents got home and found the possession order on the counter, they came to my house together. I knew they would. They had spent my whole life arriving together when there was something they wanted fixed. It was raining, not hard, just enough that my mother's hair had gone flat around her face by the time I opened the door. My father was standing beside her in the driveway with his coat unbuttoned and his car keys clenched in one hand. The same hand that had tossed my little brass key across my kitchen island. For a second, none of us spoke. Then my mother looked past me into the house. The little cedar house was sitting on the entry table by the front door. Not hidden, not off to the side, right in the middle. She saw it and started crying immediately. Not the careful crying she did in public. This was messy. Lipstick smudged, shoulders shaking. She said, You took it back. I looked at the little house, then at her, and I said, No. I stopped leaving it where it wasn't wanted. My father still had not come up the walk. He stayed at the curb for a second, like he thought distance could still make him important. Then he finally came forward. He looked older than he had 2 days earlier. Not smaller, just suddenly visible. The lines around his mouth, the gray at his temples, the terrible stubborn pride that had cost him everything before he even realized there was a price. He said, Martin says you can file the reversion tomorrow. I can. And if you do, you lose the property. He stopped, rain sliding off the end of his nose. My father had spent his whole life believing there was always one more room where he would be the person everyone listened to. The courtroom, the office, the dinner table. And now he was standing in my driveway looking at the daughter he had introduced as basically a clerk. He said very quietly, Claire, please. That word almost undid me. Not because it was enough, because it was the first time in my life I had ever heard him ask instead of expect. My mother stepped closer. She looked at the cedar house again, then at me. Then she said, We didn't know. I almost laughed. The rain, the driveway, the tiny house in my entryway. All of it suddenly felt so absurd. You knew, I said. You just thought it didn't matter because you didn't think I did. My mother covered her mouth. My father looked away. And then finally, he started crying. Not gracefully, not the way important men cry in movies with one tear and a meaningful silence. He folded, one hand over his face, shoulders shaking, standing in the rain beside the hydrangeas. My mother always made me cut back every spring. He said, I never thought you'd do this. There it was, the whole thing. Not I never thought I hurt you. Not I never thought you felt that way. I never thought you'd do this. Because somewhere inside him, he had always believed I would keep carrying the weight just to keep him comfortable. I stood there with the brass key warm in my pocket, then I took it out, the little key to the little cedar house. The thing they had laughed at. The thing they had called trash. I held it in my palm for a second. Then I looked at my father and said, "You taught me to keep everything important hidden in small places." Nobody spoke. The rain kept falling. Finally, my mother whispered, "What happens now?" I looked back through the doorway into my house, at the cedar house on the table, at the chipped blue bowl by the door, at the quiet little life inside that nobody had helped me build. Then I said, "Now I stop trying to earn my place." I closed the door gently. Later that night, I put the brass key back inside the little cedar house and set it in the center of the entry table where everyone could see it. For years, I thought I wanted my parents to feel ashamed. What I really wanted was to stop feeling ashamed of needing more than scraps. If you have ever been treated like you only mattered when you were useful, I hope you remember this. The people who keep you small are often depending on you not to notice your own size. And if there is an object in your house that still carries the shape of who somebody told you to be, maybe tonight is the night you move it somewhere new.